are a few superhero movies with well-known and influential opening title sequences. Traditionally, the genre is loud, bombastic, triumphant, and lends itself to big, flashy animated titles. As our comic book movies, on the whole, have become more sophisticated, are taken more seriously, and are, in some cases, more understated and grounded, it's become fashionable to drop openings altogether, and not just credits and themes, but even the film title, which we often save now until the very end of the movie. There are certainly superhero movies, and several movies in general, prior to Batman Begins that did that, but it became more of a trend after The Dark Knight, which I think is, safe to say, what popularized it. I never cared for that choice with The Dark Knight. Batman Begins is an origin story. We get all of Batman's background and his first adventure, he's decided what drives him and what he's all about, and then the title, Batman Begins. Arguably, he isn't really fully Batman until right at the end, just before he jumps off that roof. So it's appropriate and feels like a solid creative choice to put the logo there. It feels almost as if the whole movie is a teaser for whatever Batman does next, albeit a teaser that stands great on its own and tells a story rather than just stretching background for a whole movie before the real fun starts. But when The Dark Knight does it, it feels like it's just trying to be consistent with the previous film, and there's really no rhyme or reason to it beyond that. Once other movies start bucking that trend, it starts to feel like credits aren't cool anymore, and for some studios, especially Marvel, the film is expecting you to sit into the end of time through the 11 billion scrolling names in the end credits for an after credits scene. So why bother putting any of those names up front? And unless you're the guy from Memento, you're not gonna forget what movie you came to see minutes after you sat down, so why even have a logo until the end? Maybe I'm old-fashioned, maybe I'm set in my ways, but I really like a good opening credits scene. It probably has something to do with my love of TV intros. I want a memorable theme song. I want a logo that brags about how cool its property is and how proud the producers are to bring it to you. People use music to psych themselves out for a performance or a big game. I like a show or a movie to pump me up for the world I'm about to immerse myself in. And of course, not all openings serve the same functions. It's difficult to hold them to uniform standards because there are so many different methods of utilizing them and so many different purposes for them. Some are more like TV titles with a catchy theme song and the major credits to tell you who's involved or to tout up a big name actor or director, but others are just credits over a teaser or an opening scene, like in Blade, or just a title and nothing else, like Constantine. But for credit scenes that go on for any amount of time, the name of the game generally, besides acknowledging some of the principal figures in creating the piece, is to set the film's tone, to let you know what you're getting yourself into, like a gracious host setting the parameters for a party in his home. I thought this would be an interesting list because a lot of my big go-to superhero movies are automatically ineligible. A lot of great films these days don't have opening titles, and because a movie might be mediocre or even bad and still have a fantastic credits scene, my criteria here is mostly just how much an opening stuck with me, how much it wrapped me up in its world, and how effectively it sets the stage for the ride the movie is about to take me on. For this list, like my top 10 superhero movies of last decade video, I've decided to go with just live-action theatrical superhero movies, just to even the playing field a little. At least a couple of these may be obvious everyone would pick that selections, but I think you may be surprised by at least some of them. And now, let's begin this list of beginnings with my number 10, The Punisher from 2004. I have to say I really struggled with deciding on a movie for the 10th slot. All the other title sequences on this list were definitively great openings that stuck with me for various reasons, but for the last one I had to dig. I suppose I could have found a hidden gem I'd forgotten about that I decided was good enough to bump one of the other contenders down a notch, but that didn't happen. I revisited a number of movies that had cool openings, but it was impossible to put one above another. There are 4 or 5 that could have tied for this spot. Hulk has a really detailed opening scene chronicling Bruce Banner's father's gamma experiments, and it's creepy and strange, setting the perfect tone for that movie. The Spirit has a cool running across rooftop sequence that wonderfully showcases the green screen animation technique, and I almost picked it solely because Denny Colt staring down at Frank Miller's name from above is a really fun image. And Daredevil's cool because Matt Murdock's blind and the credits are in Braille. But ultimately, I went for a much simpler and shorter intro, one that I actually think could have been a little longer and more involved, but which I think is ultimately superior because of how well it sets the mood and subtly acknowledges its comic book roots. The 2004 Punisher movie has an animated title sequence that features bullets riddling the screen and creating the Punisher logo. Like the Batman 89 titles, it pulls back to reveal that that's what you're looking at, and it's creatively done. Black blood trickles down to create the teeth of the skull, and it's scored by a sad but lovely trumpet theme that harkens back to both westerns and mob thrillers. I never gave a lot of credence to that score, but listening to it now, it's really effective in creating a somber mood, and it's understated, like everything about this sequence. This is also one of the best examples of a company logo, in this case Marvel's, being cleverly and seamlessly integrated into the rest of the sequence. Number 9, X-Men Origins Wolverine. One of the reasons Origins is so disappointing is because it had so much potential out the gate. Despite the leaked cut that gave a lot of curious early viewers pause, I still had a lot of faith in it going in. I remember saying after the first trailer that I couldn't imagine Fox screwing this one up. One adamantium bullet to the head and a pair of gummy claws later, and I found myself eating my hat. But even in the theater, during these opening titles, I was gearing myself up for a great ride, if nothing else. It comes out the gate swinging, packing decades of back history leading up to the story's present day, from the Civil War all the way to Vietnam. It's a really well-shot montage of war scenes, establishing Logan's relationship with his brother Victor, and ultimately serving as a vignette that defines their uneasy relationship. From the Origin-inspired teaser, we see a Logan terrified that he's more animal than human, running into the woods after unjustly murdering the man he doesn't realize is his real father until it's too late. And then, presumably, he's spending all this time atoning for his sin, fighting on what he thinks is the right side of each war. I'm not sure how he wound up in the U.S. Civil War given that he's Canadian, but whatever. As he's headed down a road to redemption, Victor is gradually turning darker and darker, finding too much joy in each bloodbath until he finds himself killing a man on his own side. He seems to have less of a conscience than Logan from the beginning, more reckless and out for blood, and I'm not sure why it takes as many years as it does for Logan to finally lose control of him. But this montage in titles is easily one of the best sequences in the movie. It's epic and ultra stylized, and it feels a lot more sure of itself and focused than the rest of the film. It accomplishes quite a lot in a few minutes, getting all the major credits out while setting the stage through a series of action scenes. The credits easily could have been placed over an extended teaser with young Logan just wandering around the woods or some such, and we could have skipped to the main action in the 70s with occasional reference to the wars. Instead, we get glimpses of some of those moments without riddling the film with flashbacks, and it serves as a natural bridge from past to present rather than skipping ahead almost 100 years. I also forgot about the score here, which is perhaps, upon further reflection, underrated. It's drawing from a gazillion war movies, and the haunting choral stuff is maybe a little typical, but the main melody is dripping with tragedy, and I wish there was a little more of it. Number 8, Batman the Movie from 1966. The 1966 Batman movie titles are great because they're hilariously nothing like the rest of the movie, except for the score, a much more pure visual throwback to superhero and crime serials, which the show is, of course, partly parodying too, especially with its cliffhanger endings. A spotlight follows various shady characters around a dark alley, or possibly a boat dock, including the 4 villains, and Batman and Robin sneaking around trying to catch them. This one isn't on the list because of how well it establishes the film's tone and mood, because while there's certainly an absurd overtone, what with the couple making out in the middle of this dangerous neighborhood, and the title card just before the logo that comes out and tells us we're not watching something that's meant to be taken seriously, it looks like a noir thriller before it looks like a standard Batman episode, which is what the film looks like, just on a grander scale. With this one, I like the contrast of tones, a title sequence that deliberately looks like it almost belongs in a different movie. The score is just like the show in the music throughout the movie. It sounds more like an extended action sequence than a superhero theme. It's not the familiar na-na-na-na-na-na Batman, more like the music in the Some Days You Just Can't Get Rid of a Bomb scene. It's scored like a cartoon, with various stings and beats for each visual gag. I like how each villain's theme is integrated into the music when the spotlight highlights them. I'd usually be against the movie explaining its intentions at the beginning with a title card. What kind of movie you are should be communicated by the material itself, and you should have a pretty clear sense of it in the majority of cases within the first few minutes. But Adam West's Batman movie gets away with it because A, it's funny, and B, it's Batman. William Dozier is keenly aware that he's not making what Batman was at its inception, and in fact, his show was very nearly a more serious and brooding take on the material, judging from Adam West's screen test, which I talked about in the top 10 Batman 66 episodes video. The credits open with a mock dedication to the enemies of crime and crusaders against crime throughout the world for their inspirational example, and then to lovers of pure escapism, lovers of unadulterated entertainment, lovers of the ridiculous and the bizarre, to fun lovers everywhere. It comes right out and says this is a work of farce. And because this is Batman, a vigilante character that came out of the Zorro and Shadow traditions, it's fair that the producers might feel the need to put put a disclaimer up front. It should be clear for the material that it is pure escapism, ridiculous, and bizarre. And yet a lot of people familiar with Batman were appalled by this treatment of the character and didn't realize it knew it was a parody of Batman with Batman. Certainly that wouldn't satiate everyone even if they did get it. It's odd to make fun of a property using said property, and even though the comics were campy at the time and the show is a somewhat fair representation of what they looked like just before it aired, that's not what most Batman fans would have wanted. And it garnered that reputation more from generations after the show's airing, who were exposed to more serious, grounded versions of Batman. I've talked to several people who grew up thinking the show didn't realize how campy it was, only to discover later it was all intentional. Adam West Batman is in a category all its own, and so that disclaimer makes sense in avoiding confusion. But the show had already been on a season by the time the movie was released, so you'd think most people would be familiar with its brand of comedy by then. The real question is, where was that in the TV show? After those two messages, then you get this one. If we have overlooked any sizable groups of lovers, we apologize, which justifies the whole exercise because it's hysterical. Crime fighters and people with this particular brand of humor, those are the only two groups the producers could think of. God, I love that movie. Number 7, Guardians of the Galaxy. There are a couple Marvel movies now with really memorable end credit sequences, like Age of Ultron's fantastic statue made like a Greek sculptor immortalizing the heroes of one of the epic poems, but they've been mostly pretty light with the opening scenes. The most memorable for me to date is Guardians of the Galaxy, and it's another one that perfectly advertises the sort of ride you're strapped in for. It completely caught me by surprise in the theater, and I had this giant, goofy smile plastered on my face from the moment the Guardians of the Galaxy logo appears without warning, in time with the first sung phrase of "Come and Get Your Love." Obviously, I knew what I was getting myself into with Guardians, partly because I had seen the trailers and it was sold as a fun, quirky space adventure, but also because I've read Guardians comics and there's an absurd, sometimes silly charm to them. But it's about what are essentially morally ambiguous space pirates, so it can go to dark and violent places. So I wasn't totally surprised, like I thought I was watching the Chronicles of Riddick and all of a sudden it's Spaceballs. I knew the wild and wacky was on its way, it was just a matter of when, and I was lulled into a false sense of this is one of the suspenseful, scary scenes as I watched a lot of credits before Chris Pratt sets the tone for the whole movie with his Star-Lord dance, complete with sliding across mud and singing into an alien rodent like a microphone. As Peter Quill walks into the ancient ruins, there are so many credits I thought we'd seen all of them, and somehow I forgot we hadn't even gotten a title yet. And as there's really no set standard for credits anymore, I suppose it might have gone through a bunch of credits, a la the first scene after the intro into a TV drama, and we never see a title until the end. That's a little weird, but I feel like I've seen every other permutation of titles by now, so why not that too? Then suddenly, the title appears like it's slapping the audience back to life. Wake up! It's a drama, but it's a comedy too. Here's something fun and unexpected. Most of the sequences on this list are either disconnected from the narrative and just appropriate images with a spotlight on the credits themselves, or they're in-scene montages that are part of the story of the film. But those are snapshots of moments from before the inciting incident to set the stage. This one is, besides the teaser that sees Quill taken to space, the beginning of the movie. And while a lot of movies put their credits here, I think this one is special because of the way it manipulates expectations. And while it's a lengthy scene without a lot of story being told, as it's providing a backdrop you can divide your attention from to read the words, it's doing a bit more than creating atmosphere and establishing that its protagonist is a goofball. Right away, we see two sides to Peter Quill: the intimidating legend he's trying to pass himself off as, and the brash, headstrong show-off. He'll become even more complex as the movie progresses, but he's an instantly recognizable archetype and a natural pair of eyes into this alien world. He looks alien himself until it's revealed that he's the boy from the previous scene and still has the Watchmen, his one tie to his mother, who he just saw tragically pass away years earlier. Once he presses play and we realize who this is, we're at home. It also continues what is already becoming a music motif that serves to give Quill more and more dimension throughout the film. Each song is significant to the scene it's played in. In this case, Quill is out for fortune, and he's after an artifact that can give him that. Come and Get Your Love. The film just opens with too much panache to not include on the list. Number 6, Deadpool. Deadpool's opening titles are already legendarily funny to fans of that movie, and while they're not credits at all, since nobody's actual name is credited in them, they're as effective as any other sequence on this list in establishing tone and getting the audience prepared and in the mood for the sort of experience they're about to have. Intros for movies are sometimes like intros to rock songs. You get the melody right up front to ease you into the piece, to make you familiar with the foundation of it, and then lyrics and additional instrumentation are added later. Deadpool is a raunchy, vulgar, brutal comedy that parodies and lampoons other superhero movies and is totally self-aware. And it delivers all of that right away in its parody of opening title sequences. There's profanity in the titles, there's extreme violence in the almost still, slow-motion panoramic shot we're exploring in the eyes Deadpool's gouging out and the heads he's pumping full of lead. And there are a number of meta references to the creation of Deadpool, the production of the film, and the sordid history of superhero films. I didn't expect to see Ryan Reynolds himself on a People magazine cover and a picture of Reynolds as Green Lantern, and I really appreciate how good-humored he is about that movie. But I guess that's easy to do now that he's got his dream job and the license from Fox to go full-tilt Looney Tunes with it. And scored with Angel of the Morning, it establishes Deadpool's love of 70s and 80s pop music and his tendency to contrast all the violence in his life with wholesome, harmless, happy things. It's exciting for fans of the source material because it's immediately clear that we're looking at a labor of love, and that the creative team behind the film gets this specific brand of comedy. But it's also useful to the uninitiated because it gives Deadpool virgins a really good sense of what they're getting themselves into by finding a way to check off a box for each of those categories: parody, vulgarity, and violence. And might help you realize you walked into the wrong theater, or already figure out before you get too far into what might be a torture chamber of this isn't for you, that if this isn't your jam, you've gambled your $10 and lost. The credits themselves, which are amusing, snide, and sarcastic descriptions of the people involved, satirize the commercial and formulaic nature of superhero movies, which the film itself proceeds to do throughout. It credits a British villain, a moody teen, a CGI character, and a gratuitous cameo, all eye-roll-inducing cliches in the genre at this point. It says, "We've all been here and done this before, and superhero movies are so in vogue, you're gonna see all this again. The difference this time is we know what we are, we know what the expectations are, and we're gonna poke fun of ourselves and the genre while we do it all for the umpteenth time." I'm not saying Deadpool is the first successful superhero parody, or that this is wholly original in how it's going about it, but it is unusual to have a mainstream movie set more or less in a long-running, proven franchise like X-Men that is simultaneously a spoof and a legitimate entry in that series. The titles fully acknowledge that. Deadpool is a movie that, in a lot of ways, toes the line and meets mainstream movie expectations, and in other ways, refuses to play by the rules. The credit scene is the perfect encapsulation of that. It tells you all the typical stuff it's going to do, but it feels original in its knowing it's doing that, and it walks a line between playing it safe and lampooning those things. It breaks the rules in having a credit scene that isn't really a credit scene, but then is it even a rule anymore that you have to have those in the first place? It's hilarious and also one of the best examples of a tonal thesis statement at the beginning of a film. Number 5, Spider-Man 2. Choosing between all the Spider-Man openings for this list was a struggle. I really like Danny Elfman's theme, and that first title sequence always stuck with me because of it. And regardless of how disappointing Spider-Man 3 turned out, I like its titles a lot too, again, mostly because of score. Both the Sandman and Venom themes are memorable and are deserving of a better movie. So I went with Spider-Man 2 because it still has Elfman's moody, whimsical, and intrepid titles music, exactly as they were in the previous movie, but with more inspired visuals than the other two films. The titles provide a recap of the previous movie, mostly through fantastic artist renderings provided by the king of comic covers, Alex Ross. It homages the comics medium and firmly plants our feet in a heightened comic book world before the movie begins, without getting cutesy about it. We get a mix of photography and art, with abstract shapes vaguely resembling the lines on Spider-Man's costume, splitting up the pictures like comic panels. It acknowledges both film and comic mediums in this way, although curiously, we're only looking at actual photography with Mary Jane. I don't know why that is. The story of the first movie is recapped without veering into clip show territory like the titles in Superman 2. At first, I thought we were just looking at random images from the previous movie, but they're presented linearly and mostly are the most significant moments, both in setting the stage for the sequel and for the major character and thematic beats in that movie. Peter trying to use his powers for personal gain, letting the burglar get away, losing his uncle, etc. And I like that right after the drawing of Peter standing over his dying uncle, we get the classic split Peter Parker Spider-Man face that comes up all over the comics. He's learning the responsibility lesson and creating the dual identity so he can use his powers not for fame or glory, but because it's the right thing to do. Unlike other superheroes, Peter and Spider-Man are one and the same all the time. And of course, all the personal drama in his life now comes from the choice to live a double life. So while Peter's whininess is a major detractor for these movies, I really like the brooding yet determined expression Ross gives Peter in that picture. Sam Raimi did his best to capture the serialized nature of Spider-Man in his movies. While he could only release one every 2 or 3 years, they aren't disconnected adventures, but an ongoing drama. So reminding us what happened the last movie is appropriate because this one is building on those things, primarily regarding Harry Osborn and Spider-Man's involvement with his father's death, however effectively you think the movie handles those things. My favorite drawings in the sequence include the split Peter Parker Spider-Man face and the one with Norman and the Goblin in Spider-Man's eye. That mask looks a lot more menacing and less silly than the one in the movie, and I wonder if that's not a concept art picture or based on concept art. And I think it's inspired to put Norman and Goblin next to each other like that, given his multiple personality condition. And in Spider-Man's mask, because they have dual identities in common, and he's a mirror for Spider-Man. But also because he's the only person who knows Norman and the Goblin are the same person. It's a shame that wasn't the box art for the first film. I also love the Marvels-inspired Spider-Man climbing a wall, classic Ross on Spider-Man, and even though the webbing is still raised, those eyes make it look Ditko Spider-Man as much as it looks like the movie version. I also love that Macho Man Randy Savage is immortalized as Bonesaw, even if it is from the back. Of all of these, that's probably the one I'd be most willing to pay for a big poster of. That scene is hilarious and one of the most quotable in comic book movies. I got you for 5 minutes! 5 minutes of playtime! Finally, just for the sake of transition, I think it was a smart choice to go with artist renderings moving into the first frame of the film, since it's another drawing of Mary Jane on the poster of her play. Ultimately, I think I'm going with this one because it reminds me of all the things I most liked about the first movie, and as I'm writing this, it has me appreciating it more than I have before. That movie is maybe due for another once-over. You may see it revisited on Superhero Rewind in the not-too-distant future. Number 4, X-Men Days of Future Past. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this one, as I just spent over an hour simultaneously gushing over and dissecting X-Men Days of Future Past under a microscope. I was so thorough with that review, I've already revealed a lot of why I love this intro there. It was hard choosing this one over the X2 titles, and if I was being completely honest and going with my gut rather than going for a bit of variety and trying to make this list interesting to you, the viewer, I might have included them both. So, you're welcome. The Days of Future Past title surpassed the X2 sequence for me now because of its boldness, its infectious excitement about bringing Singer's sensibilities and his cast back to X-Men, and on a totally biased fan level, I get as giddy as a schoolgirl on prom night whenever I see it. I talked about the music in the rewind. I was so stoked to get this back as the definitive X-Men movie theme, and I felt like Ottman knew I was watching and ramped up the anticipation for the main melody just to make me squirm in my seat. It feels like it's trying to start a tradition, one that Apocalypse has continued, but who knows if it will continue into the 90s period movie, given that at the time of this recording, there's no word yet on who's directing that. Interestingly, the Singer X-Men titles aren't credit sequences, they're just title logos. They tell you what studios are involved and give you the logo, and that's it. Everything else is in the closing credits. With Days of Future Past, I might have expected at least starring credits for Patrick Stewart, James McAvoy, and Hugh Jackman, but then you'd probably want McKellen and Fassbender in there, and then Jennifer Lawrence is the third point of that triad we started with in First Class and has a significant character arc, not to mention her popularity right then, so we'd probably have to get her in there too, and at that point you might as well just include the whole cast, as gargantuan as it is. So yeah, short and sweet is better. We're also going back to the tradition of DNA and evolution imagery, this time the genetically modified Mystique DNA added to the organic Sentinels to allow them to adapt to mutant powers. I like the effect of the DNA changing. It looks just like Mystique's morphing effect, and the Sentinels look the same when they're adapting in battle. While the main action happens in the past, and that's a direct sequel to First Class, it's appropriate to bring back Ottman and Singer's X2 style intro because that's the lens we go back and view the world in 1973 from with Wolverine, and because that's the flavor we're, more or less, soft rebooting back into. The film blends what felt like, to some degree, two X-Men worlds into an updated version of what came before. John Ottman's X-Men theme is probably in my top 3, and bringing it back after all that time and in such an attention-grabbing way puts this one over the top for the main X-Men movies. Yeah, X-Men Origins and Deadpool are here too, but they're side movies and made by entirely different creative teams. Number 3. Richard Donner's Superman. This pick should come as no shock to anyone. The Superman title sequence is one of the most famous in cinema and has been homaged, ripped off, and lampooned a gazillion times since. I even ripped it off for years here on Superhero Rewind. It's big and eye-catching and energetic and deceptively simple. It's an epic, totally immersive opening, but it's just credits flying at us through space with block letters that whiz past at warp speed, with the occasional spatial phenomena to break up the monotony. It's a sequence I imagine a kid who knew what he was doing could almost perfectly recreate on an iPad now, but at the time, it was state-of-the-art and quite expensive, which is why the canon opening for Superman 4 looks so cheap and thrown together. Originally, according to Ilya Salkind in his commentary, the credits were intended to be played over Kal-El's journey to Earth, but for whatever reason, it was decided to put them right up front after the head-scratching comic book opening. And ever wonder why that kid is talking about Metropolis and the Daily Planet in 1938, but when we go inside his comic book, it looks like the 70s? It would have made a lot of sense to travel with the spaceship as we're seeing the credits, and the words and score could have been exactly the same. The credits and logo wouldn't be seen until after Marlon Brando earns his hefty paycheck, because the movie isn't called Jor-El, it's called Superman, and the ship crashes right after we've been treated to John Williams' triumphant and uplifting fanfare. And the Kents find the baby and Clark Kent begins his journey. But leading with the opening allows Donner and company to set the movie's heroic tone before getting into the Shakespearean-esque political and technical speak of the Krypton scene, which might have seemed pretentious and overly serious for the material without the bombastic, high-flying nature of the titles. It's also a long, more traditional introduction that puts all of its major credits up front, though not every credit, as was customary in the early days of cinema, and was sometimes in practice even through the 70s. Imagine Superman just ending like Wizard of Oz with "The End." With a special effects picture like this, there was probably no asking the audience to sit through every name you see in the end credits flying at them at the start. And as many credits as this film boasts, it doesn't hold a candle to special effects pictures now. I'm to the point where I get surprised by how short end credits from this era are. After any given genre movie made in the last decade, I can make a sandwich, read a comic book, make a phone call to my mother, write and stamp a postcard, and beat the original Super Mario Bros. Game before the credits are over. Can you imagine if we still expected audiences to sit through every credit before the movie began? What would Danger Diabolic look like if it were made today and had CG effects? You'd be watching that trippy spinning paint swirl for a week, and it'd be done in a computer. Deep, deep down, deep, deep down. People will sometimes say, it's okay if we're a few minutes late to the movie, we're only missing the trailers. If we still did that, everyone would be like, says the movie starts at 2, but that really means 2:30. But the Superman titles are still pretty lengthy, so it might have halted natural pacing to suddenly have several minutes of titles after what's essentially an entire first act of a film, since Superman is a 3-act epic split over 3 distinct time periods. It's a little odd because since it does the Star Wars thing and seamlessly takes us from the credits to a particular place out in space, the audience goes on a really bizarre trip to get to Krypton if you're paying attention. By the way, I'm curious as to whether it was influenced at all by Star Wars, as that movie came out just a year earlier. And Williams is at the height of his game during this period, creating 2 of the most iconic movie scores back to back, and given the similarities in the scores, I imagine Superman doesn't sound exactly like this without Star Wars. If its titles were made last minute, I suppose it's possible it's even visually looking at that film. But as much 2001 influence as is in Superman, I could just as easily buy it looking like this even without Star Wars. It's easy to think of it, of course, as just introductory imagery. The story doesn't really begin until we pass Krypton's sun and get to the frozen planet itself. But because we go into a comic book, and then we're traveling and we actually get to a destination that opens the film, I can't help but feel weirdly disoriented once I start thinking about it. Before the credits begin, we're looking at a comic book on a standard tube TV somebody would have in their living room. Then we go inside a comic book to the Daily Planet in 1938, and then the TV turns into a movie theater screen, and now we're in space. None of these things really logically follow the other, and seems they're just to acknowledge Superman history in different media. You've seen it in comics, it started way back in 38, you've seen it in black and white on the small screen, and now finally it's a big screen blockbuster. Never mind that the first time Superman was seen in moving pictures, it was in movie theaters, both in animation and live action. But anyway, now that we've made that strange journey, we're going from some undisclosed point in space all the way to Krypton, only to make the journey from Krypton to Earth again later. Superman's opening makes a couple of bold statements and daring promises. It exudes confidence, telling us it's not remotely timid of this often perceived silly and kiddish comic book material. It looks immensely proud of what it has in store for us, like it's something truly unique and special, not a cash grab trying to make a couple bucks on a recognizable name, but an experience you won't forget and you won't be the same without. It promises an epic adventure, and it sets its expectations really high. If that movie isn't worth John Williams' fanfare, it's a way bigger letdown than it would have been if it was just a lackluster story. That march is one of the most recognized and beloved because it fits the material as well as any film music ever has. There are a lot of different Superman themes, of course, but if you ask anybody to hum one, 99% of them will hum this one. It lovingly harkens back to the Fleischer Superman theme while updating it and adapting it as the soundtrack to a science fiction epic rather than a cartoon adventure serial. As with a lot of Williams' overtures, it hits most of the movie's major thematic and emotional beats without getting into the comedic Lex Luthor melody. It's grand and optimistic and upbeat, but when it gets into the "Can You Read My Mind" bridge, it becomes romantic and introspective, suggesting a movie with heart and humanity and not just a perfect archetypal hero flying around saving people. The titles are made even better because the film really is as stunning and inspiring as they promise. Number 2. Batman from 1989. Batman has a famously creative opening sequence that sees its credits appear in front of a trip, in, around, and then outside of a giant stone version of the famous bat symbol. On first viewing, most people don't seem to have any idea what they're looking at until the camera finally starts to spin and pan out to reveal the familiar shape. For some, it's a puzzle to solve, all these weird curves and points and strange shadows. For others, it's so tonally appropriate to the material, it's just gritty, dark, abstract shapes you wouldn't even think to decipher. But for most of us, when we finally see what we've been inspecting up close with a microscope for no good reason, all this random jagged rock, it's a neat reveal. Oh, it's the logo, the thing the movie has been most sold on. As I've discussed before, that image and the promise of serious dark Batman was practically all Warner's needed to sell the movie. It's a wonderfully provocative logo that set my imagination on fire as a kid. It's mysterious, strange, and haunting, everything this version of the character is meant to be. I like that it's made of stone, hard and impenetrable as the persona Bruce Wayne has built for himself. I'm not sure how much of it is practical and how much is animated, but with as much miniature work as there is in that film, I imagine that at least some of it is done with a practical model. We're not actually looking at the world we'll inhabit in this movie yet, or even anything that exists in that world. I have no idea why there would be a Roman-esque statue or wall carving of the bat symbol anywhere in this universe, especially at the beginning, when no one has a picture of Batman or would have seen that symbol. Or maybe somebody did see it and got it wrong. After all, the logo isn't the same as the bat Batman has on his chest. But despite that, this opening sets the film's mood perfectly. The symbol is dirty and worn, like the streets of Gotham City. It looks like a Gothic sculpture once you see it in full, and flying through its nooks and crevices evokes the Batcave, which I also imagine some people might have thought they were looking at. In his commentary, Tim Burton describes the titles as moving through the dark recesses of the mind, and then pulling back to see what's really there, which is interesting since one of the criticisms often lobbed at this film is that we don't get inside Batman's head, that we're never able to to really understand the man. Burton has always argued that that's the point, that he is detached from humanity and is an enigma not meant to be understood even by the audience. And yet, the inside of the bat symbol is meant to be the mind we never delve into. But perhaps the idea is Bruce Wayne's mind is hollowed out, that all that's left is darkness and shadows, and that what humanity is left there is difficult to find. For Bruce, the outside really does match the inside, and it's Vicky Vale who has to work at finding the real man, however effective you think that part of it is. The tone is also set brilliantly by Danny Elfman's score, a driving, brutish, haunting march that's as instantly a perfect musical description of the character of Batman as John Williams' fanfare is for Superman. Considering the film was sold almost as hard on Prince's music as it was the Bat logo, it's almost surprising that the opening credits aren't scored with one of his pop tracks. And we do immediately hear one as incidental music on the street in the opening scene. One of the first sounds in the film is "I've Seen the Future and It Will Be," played on a boombox. As much as I like Prince's soundtrack, I'm glad it doesn't score the movie, but rather serves as the popular songs characters are using throughout the film in universe. Opening with one of those songs, maybe regardless of what the credits looked like, might have seemed gimmicky, and like Burton was so timid about whether people would believe his Batman that he had to rely on something else to carry the piece. Elfman's march suggests a stylized, ultra-heightened reality, and we're already prepared for an unrealistic, out-of-time world before we even see what it looks like. The sequence has been really influential on movies after it, a lot of close-up examination of things we don't have the full picture of. The Hellboy title sequence is basically this, though a lot faster with that logo, and it uses a lot of other imagery as well. I'm not sure 89 is the first title sequence like this, but I think it's safe to say it popularized it. I'll review this eventually, though I may be blowing the only thing I really have much to say on with it right here, but the direct-to-video LEGO Batman 2 tie-in movie opens with a great parody of this title sequence that explores a similar Bat logo made out of Legos. The LEGO Batman games heavily use Elfman's score, and I'll never understand why they don't also incorporate some of Batman Return's score just for the sake of variety, so I really appreciated that since I kind of expected music from 89 to be recycled all through that movie like it is the video game. I enjoyed that movie, but that might sadly be the coolest thing in it. Anyway, 89's titles still stand out to me as one of the more creative and memorable of opening sequences in the movies. And my number one favorite opening title sequence, Watchmen. Given that I've always been an unapologetic fan of the Watchmen movie, it's probably no surprise to anyone familiar with this series that it's my number one pick. I began to fall in love with this film during the title sequence and only hoped the rest of the movie would live up to it. For me, it did. The Watchmen opening was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was breathtaking for me because of all the images from the comic I was familiar with that were brought to life beautifully through a seamless mix of live action and computer animation. Well, mostly seamless. There's some not so great green screen. From all the alternate history and early imagery from the Minutemen days all the way up to 1985, it was clear that while Watchmen might be the unfilmable graphic novel, Zack Snyder was going to do his darndest to bring it to screen, and his passion for the material is tangible in that opening. With the teaser, in which the comedian is murdered in his apartment, Snyder has already introduced us to the ultra-stylized flavor of the piece, the brutality of it, his meticulous attention to visual details, and the way in which he's attempting to translate the key and iconic moments of the comic book to screen, through the signature slow-motion method he popularized in 300. But the opening titles give us a lot more information, in further peeling back the curtain to reveal the scope of this alternate universe, and in communicating to the initiated both how much care and respect he has for the source material, and in his choice to take certain creative liberties. I never mind changes from book to screen, even major changes, if a piece stands on its own without an audience needing a prerequisite to enter the theater. And those changes are logical and warranted, either for the sake of adaptation to another medium, or because an argument can be made for those changes improving on the original material. That's where a lot of contention happens with this movie, of course. As I've said before, I like Snyder's ending better than the original, but I also understand the argument from folks who would have preferred a more pure translation from page to screen. Because Watchmen is such a beloved piece, and because so much of the work is directly or nearly directly lifted verbatim from the graphic novel, I appreciate the telegraphing of alterations here, specifically with the comedian killing JFK. That's not in the book, but always struck me as an appropriate addition. It's not so jarring, then, when the ending is retooled. I can't imagine what watching Watchmen is like without knowing the source material. material. I said when I reviewed it that surely fresh eyes would catch Ozymandias almost immediately as the mastermind behind the Cape Killer plot, and I read a lot of comments from viewers claiming they were completely in the dark until the reveal and telling me Matthew William Good was, well, really good, and they didn't feel like he was telegraphing that at all. So what do I know? But I always imagine people might have a little sensory overload on first viewing, and at the very least, they couldn't possibly appreciate everything they were seeing in this opening, taking them through decades of history, establishing fictional events that parallel but are different from how they happened in real life, establishing major characters in the movie as well as some of their predecessors, and setting up the status quo of the anti-vigilante society of 1985 versus the good old days of the Minutemen, which really weren't, of course, the good old days at all. But whether you can pick up everything at once or it takes a couple of viewings, this sequence gets a whole lot done in building the world and introducing us to not just the initial premise, but some of the social themes of the film: justice, power, authority, urban upheaval. I also couldn't help but place Watchmen in the #1 spot because of Bob Dylan's The Times They Are A-Changing, maybe the most inspired choice for a popular song in an introduction. The cynical lyrics resonate throughout, as we see the world changed by superheroes and then the world changing around superheroes, becoming more violent, maybe because of people who create chaos by taking the law into their own hands, or maybe because they failed at setting the right example so more people would do the selfless thing and help to make the world a better place. We hear Dylan's words about changing with the times or being swallowed up by them. You better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. I don't think that sequence is nearly as powerful without that song anchoring this trip through time with its fully appropriate lyrics, almost as if it were written for this movie. It hit me like a ton of bricks when I first saw the film because, loath as I am to admit it, I'd never heard that song before, and as soon as I started picking up on its thematic connection to the material, I focused more on the words than I did even on what I was seeing. I don't know if this was intentional, but I also remember thinking the first time I saw the film that it was really bold in such a controversial adaptation with huge expectations and a lot of fans crying foul that you'd even attempt to translate it to screen, that you'd choose a song for your opening credits that includes the lyrics, "Don't criticize what you can't understand." Snyder's director of photography, Larry Fong, who also worked on Batman v Superman, deserves a lot of the credit for this outstanding and memorable sequence, and you can see the same sensibilities and sense of style in the introduction for that film. Fong might even be the reason Batman v Superman has an opening title sequence, when Man of Steel followed the Nolan Batman model and dispensed with the titles altogether. I've been confounded by Snyder's work in recent years, but the ultimate cut of Watchmen still holds up for me as a near masterpiece, and its title sequence is, to quote Nat King Cole, unforgettable. And there you have it. I never thought I'd have so much to say about movie title sequences, but they can be incredibly important in hooking an audience from the get-go, like the opening line in a novel or the first breathtaking splash page in a comic book. It's not a lost art, but one we see a little less frequently now. A movie certainly doesn't have to have one. Establishing the flavor of a movie and the kind of universe you're in can be just as effective in an opening scene, and there's certainly something to be said for not being distracted by real-world names and production roles while you're hoping to be swept up in a fictional world. And title sequences can be really risky. A mediocre sequence might signal to the audience that the film was a rush job, or that the filmmaker's hearts weren't in it. Or an amazing title sequence can make a movie that much more of a letdown by giving an audience's hopes up, only to deliver a lackluster or depressing experience. It's all a matter of creating the most cohesive, consistent, and engaging experience possible from beginning to end.